right, well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to Making Confluence Macros Easy. And by easy I kind of mean, for now, for the user, not so much for you, but you should find that it's pretty simple, the changes I need you to make. And it shouldn't even take you maybe no longer than 5 minutes for a macro. First up, if I could get a little bit of audience participation, if you can throw your hands in the air for me if you've written a Confluence plugin. Many of you are putting hands up, excellent. All right, keep those hands up if you've done a Confluence macro. Almost the same number, hang on, more hands, how does that work? All right. Okay, now for those macros, have you added basic metadata for all of your macros? So they appear in the macro browser with an icon, a title, a description. Nice work, okay, good work so far people, that's maybe 3 or 4. Now have you added metadata for all of your macro parameters? So the form that appears once you select a macro has title, description, perhaps a custom type. All right, wise guys. Right, have you done a custom user interface using JavaScript hooks? Jeez. All right, you, come on. Okay, most people wouldn't have. It is even possible, but I'll take you through each of these steps here this afternoon. One reason that you would want to, or everyone who put their hands down as soon as I got to the basic metadata, one reason you would want to put your hands back up again is that in 4.0, there's no wiki markup, and parameters. Yeah, put your hand back down, Ryan. Okay, as you might have seen in Ryan's talk, sorry, give him some cred. As you may have seen, if you don't have metadata on your macros, they may not appear in the macro browser at all in 4.0, so it's really important that you get it in there. But it's not all doom and gloom. First up, a lot of people just exited the room a couple of minutes ago to go and monetize and kind of market their plugins. But I kind of view that the macro browser is kind of an advertisement too. You're putting your things in front of users, not just sysadmins. And people who can browse and search and easily use your macros are likely to increase renewals and increase basically the admin having nice things to say about them. So it's important that you put it in there. Another thing is that I don't know how many of you have been updating, conscientiously your notation guides. So that VM file that kind of hangs off the side, it's not related at all to your official online documentation, but it's kind of expected that you keep the two in sync whenever you make changes. I've seen a few in my time at Confluence that they're way out. They're out by 6 months or so, so you won't have to worry about that anymore. Also, like I said, it takes about 5 minutes a macro, and I do encourage you to do it. What we're going to cover this afternoon is the very basic stuff, so what appears in the macro browser itself on the main screen, then what you see in the macro form, the second screen once you've selected a macro. I'll give you a really basic intro to some of the JavaScript hooks that we had to make available to do some tricky stuff, for example with the Office connector, and then, like I say, a 5-minute demo of me just rigging up some metadata for a really basic macro. You may be wondering now, who is it who is doing this talk? Unless you've read all of my specs on the CAC page, my name's David Taylor, and I've been a Confluence developer for about 3 years now. And I've done a couple of back-end work, like back-end only features, but almost everything's been front-end. In fact, if you're paying attention during Scott's kind of recital of everything going from 3.0 up to 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, yeah, most of the bugs in those under the line are to do with me. So things to do with the autocomplete and the property panels and the macro browser and the insert menu, all that kind of thing. And I co-wrote the macro browser, so hopefully later I'll be able to answer any questions you might have. You probably all know the macro browser, but there may be 1 or 2 of you who need a bit of a brief history lesson, so I'll just take you back a year and a half. It was Confluence 3.0 when we first dropped the macro browser in. It had all of the basic functionality that you see today. You could, hey, there it goes. You could browse using some kind of logical categorization of your macros, and something I slipped in there halfway through, which I thought was pretty important, was the search, so that you can search for a macro based on its title and its description. 3.1, now this is funny, I almost got this into 3.0. I don't know how you are with developers. You think you can ship a cool feature and just kind of slide it in just before the release. I wanted to get something similar to our kind of quick nav, our drop-down search that you see on the main screen of Confluence. I wanted to get that into the macro browser. I thought we have the infrastructure for it, let's go for it, how cool would that be? And our dev manager, Per Fragman, said, oh, it's too risky, no, can't do it, no. So yeah, I got shot down, but yeah, I got back. I just committed it to trunk as soon as we did the main build of 3.0, and it went into 3.1. Bit quiet on the macro browser in 3.2. I don't know if you've seen it in action, but we now have autocomplete inside the rich text editor, so that eases that transition for the hardcore wiki markup users. In this case, you do a square bracket, start typing, and it's going to pop up with some link suggestions for you. In 3.3, we updated some of the infrastructure so that we could reuse our macro browser logic and get macros coming up there. You might notice that, yeah, the icons work as well. So metadata that you add in the macro browser is going to appear there as well. So let's start with the basics. I have a sample macro that I'm just going to take you through, and it's really no output whatsoever. You all know how to do awesome macros that render interesting things. This one just renders pretty much the parameters that you pass it. You want to keep your eyes a bit more on the form on the right-hand side of the screen rather than the left-hand side of the screen, or I'll just focus on that. So most of you have heard or now used the Atlassian SDK after downloading it yesterday, if you didn't already have it. And if you run, as I did here, Atlas create Confluence plugin from the command line, it'll do a little kind of shell of a macro module descriptor for you. If I were to start up and look at that in the macro browser, it's not too inspired. I could have some awesome logic in my Java at the back end, but the people who kept their hands down, this is kind of what you're looking like to your users at the moment. It's pretty hard to see it in there, and if there's a whole screen full, yeah, you might have just missed it, and you know, it doesn't do much for anyone. Okay, my mascot at Confluence is the Ninja Hamster. People internally have probably seen it on EAC in a few mock-ups. And those of you who are doing internal plugins, so the ones of you who aren't doing this for resale, I do encourage you to get creative and rip off some really nice artwork for your macro browser things. It makes it really easy for people to find it, for starters, and also it makes it a little bit interesting. In fact, that's what the rest of the metadata is all about. Okay. Now what I'm going to need to add, for starters, a title and description. You probably already have an I-18 and resource file, so I won't go into that in too much detail. I'll tell you how we use convention to set those later. Also images. We want to show a hamster somehow. He's going to have to be in a resource download. Nothing too much exciting there. And the only change that you're going to make so far is just going to be to add an icon reference inside your macro descriptor. And you should see something a bit interesting. But first you will have to update your I-18N file. Now we know that everyone has hopefully a unique macro name, and it's unique inside a plugin. So if you set a plugin key plus a macro name, it should be canonical and basically unique. So all you need to do after that to get a good label coming up or a description is specify that at the end. It's pretty much falling over stuff. So if you haven't done that already, just do it now while I'm talking. So you're looking a little bit better in the macro browser already. All right, and that was pretty quick. You can already search on description, so a lot of times the user might not necessarily know what the name of your macro is to begin with. They're just going to be looking for something. So in this case, it's going to look up parameters, and it's going to find that in the description. Again, straightforward. And also anything that works in the macro browser works in the autocomplete as well. Although with a little caveat, I had some bad feedback at one stage that people were typing the into the text field here, coming up with too many descriptions. So we kind of rolled it back just to the title for now. So if you do see anything with your testing that looks odd, that'll be it. All right. Also in the basic metadata is the documentation URL. Okay, finally you can just put a simple link somewhere so that people will be able to see that online. All right. So having done all of that, this is what the user will be looking at if they click on your macro and go to the form. And yeah, it's not too exciting. And in fact, you wouldn't see this in 4.0. Okay, so that wiki markup won't be available. So we'll have to start looking at some actual parameter metadata next. All right. Now before I really get into the parameters element, I'll give you a bit of a gotcha and a little bit of a brief history lesson on some of the weird stuff we did under the hood. So we want to just stick a category in. I forgot to mention that before, of course. You know, you need to add a category element so that you can specify which tab it's going to appear in the browser. So if I do that and then I refresh my browser, I don't get a hamster. All right. And the problem with that is it's due to the way that we actually coded at which level in, oh, hello. Okay, I'll just come up a little bit there. All right. At which level in Confluence we decided that you had really made an effort and you'd added some metadata, we kind of ended up with two main branches, which is freeform macros, and we ended up with fully qualified kind of metadata-rich macros. And we needed to know at which point you'd done that. It was if you'd added parameters. If you add just an empty parameter string, we'll assume that you have no parameters so far, but it also means that we'll load up all of the rest of the metadata into the browser. So it's usually the first thing that you'll want to do when you're kind of pimping up your macro metadata module. And there he goes. So yeah, little hint is as soon as you go into your next macro that you're working on, always add parameters. I'm almost on the verge of encouraging Don to perhaps just stick that into the archetype when these things are getting generated by the SDK. It's just that important. Now, if you specify an empty parameters element, you're probably not going to be surprised to see that you have an empty parameter form as well. You may possibly have one of your macros that's in that situation, and it's much easier for the user to use because they know they have nothing to do. They just press refresh. If they wish, they press insert. They get the macro coming in there. But yeah, you probably have a lot of macro parameters. The most simple type is the string, as you might expect. But inside the parameter element, we have two required attributes. Obviously the name, but also the type. We did think that we could always just kind of fall back onto the string type because, you know, at the end of the day, you could always represent it with a text field. But we want you to think about it a little bit because as I'll show you in a few minutes, we actually expose a number of different types. And even though some of them don't have rich UI interfaces, they don't have rich UIs yet, in the future when we roll things out, we could have things like input validation for phone numbers, URLs, we could have pickers for colors and things like that. I'll go through those in a moment. Again, the internationalization is just by convention, but now we just have a param in the middle there. Pretty straightforward. You stick in the param name, label and description as per usual, and if you pull that up in the macro browser, you know, you've got that already. So I think how much did you have to do? You would have had to added maybe 2 lines of XML, a couple of things in the internationalization file, and that just works for you. You may be still thinking though, oh, back in the wiki markup days, we wanted to make it as easy as possible for our users to, you know, type in their wiki markup for the macro. So my parameters don't actually have names. It's okay for one parameter. What we let you do is have an empty name. That will work, and in the internationalization, you can just leave kind of 2 dots together as a single blank, and that'll do the job. However, if you have kind of an ordered array rather than an actual map of parameters, you're in trouble, and you probably have been in trouble since 2009 when we first had the macro browser, because that's not really supported. You'd end up with multiple things with the same blank name, and that's not going to work. One thing we certainly do support is aliases. A few of you probably have the case where you might have that it's a default, but you'll also have that it's allowed to have a key. And if you do, then you specify an alias element inside your parameter element, and when it reads, say, string or string param in the wiki markup or the macro descriptor, it'll just map that to the correct field in the macro browser. This still is going to have an empty string in there, so what I'd probably generally recommend is switching those around a little bit, have something that's a bit more user-friendly, and then just stick the default one as one of your aliases. You can also make fields required. We don't have a lot of validation in there, so we don't have, like I said, yet a lot of JavaScript front end that's perhaps validating on URLs, whether they're correct or not. You might have to do that at the back end still. But we can certainly check to see if a field that has to have something in it has had something added to it. Just add a required attribute of true, and then when you look in the macro form, you'll see that you have a little asterisk indicating something has to go on there, plus the insert button is going to be grayed out, so the user can't try to submit some bad information to the server and then get an error in their preview, or it just won't make any sense. Now, what if you need somebody? What if you have a body macro? Then the work's pretty much done for you already. If you specify has body false or has body to return true in the actual Java code itself, then we will put a body into the macro browser. You don't have to specify anything else. And if you do want to specify some internationalization text to make it easier for the user to know what they're allowed to put into the body, then you just use the same convention but replace param with body. It appears at the top of the form. So you might sometimes think, well, it kind of pushes everything down a little bit. But for example, with the chart macro, which could have, I think, in excess of 40 parameters, the body would get completely lost down the bottom. So that just gets put at the top, and then everything else is below it. But as you would have seen in Ryan's talk, it's not going to be there for too much longer. In 4.0, it's going to get shifted back into the RTE. So your label and your description won't do too much unless Ryan does something clever and maybe does a tooltip for you. All right, obviously more than just strings and bodies. Booleans, also very basic and handled. And enums, which are a little bit more interesting. You get to add now a value element inside your parameter. And in this case, I've actually added a blank one at the top and set required true to force the user to make a particular selection. You can always just have it default to the top one of the list of values that you add in there. One thing that I'm ashamed to say that we don't have yet is internationalization for these, but complain enough and I'm sure we'll get it in there for the next release. So you'll be able to say something like enumParam.enumValue.foo.bar.baz, and we can do something a bit cleverer there. Other types. Now, this is why I said that the type is a required attribute, is that we supply a couple of ones that we found when we were working through the core Confluence macros when we were originally developing the macro browser. We went through all of our macros that we bundled and we said, all right, well, what kind of string is this? Is it just a title? Is it just kind of a dumb string? Or is it somewhat clever? Should it have a color, an RGB value? Should it have a relative date? And we set up a few different types that you could put in there. Now, unfortunately, we did not end up with enough time to do a fancy UI for these things. It does make sense to have a color picker for a color type. But the cool thing is that if you specify a type of color in your macro, then even though it'll use a string for now, when we end up updating that UI, you'll just, of course, get that included in your macro. So consider them parked for now. Defaults as well. So say I had a new attribute called default in my parameter element. What that enables you to do is to put some information in front of user when it doesn't really make sense to show them a blank field. You might, for example, have a width that would have a default number of pixels. So rather than encouraging them to type something in and perhaps get it wrong, you can just show them something. But when the macro descriptor itself is written out, it doesn't have to have that default in there. That gives you a little bit of flexibility to change what that default is later, and the user doesn't have to be any the wiser. Another thing, as you may have expected, the order that they're in the XML file is the same order that they appear in the macro browser. Reshuffling in the browser is just a case of changing the order in there and then refreshing your plugin. All right. Sorry. Okay, so I've shown you some fairly basic stuff yet, but I didn't get to show you the cool stuff from 3.1. So I was pretty pleased with this. Now, you've probably used the autocomplete fields already. You have a blank field, you start typing something in, you key up or key down to select something from the list, and then it inserts whatever the actual internal value is. And you might ask yourself, do I have to do anything tricky in my XML descriptor? And of course you don't. You knew that already. You just have to specify the correct type. In this case, it's Confluence content, which enables you to search for anything that you could search from the quick nav bar. You can also perform some filtering. If you specify an option inside of your parameter, you can effectively pass data to the front end so that the JavaScript code that actually creates the UI component can use that without having to specify it in any custom JavaScript of your own. We've done this for the Confluence content component, but you could just as easily do this for your own. If anyone wants to know more about what the actual option does, how it passes it to the front end, just talk to me later. Okay, as you might expect, space keys and usernames are much the same deal. You search by the space description, and then the macro gets the space key. Same thing for usernames. Okay, so this is all fairly tame stuff. You're probably wondering, okay, I could have figured that out already. Now, we have some things that aren't ready for prime time. We have some other things that are kind of ready, but you have to be a bit braver to get to them. Now, multiples, we didn't quite get there. You could use an autocomplete, but then if you want to have 2 or 3 or 4 users, what do you do? Again, I kind of had a spike going, but it wasn't ready for prime time. So we had to fall back to just using a string. If you specify a type that would normally be an autocomplete, but you specify multiple equals true, it'll fall back to a string whereby the user would just do what they would normally do and comma separate them. Now, you probably all heard that in Jira 4.2 there's a brand new autocomplete control, and we're looking forward to being able to pull that out of there, include it in Confluence, and perhaps do something with this. All right. Now it starts getting techie. When we needed to do the Office connector, for example, we found that just the default logic that we'd created to put a few different components onto the form there, it wasn't quite enough. So we needed to write some custom JavaScript which could really alter the way that the form was laid out and how it handled the parameters. And you can do that too with yours. You would first of all need to specify a context of the macro browser so that your JavaScript web resource gets pulled in. And of course, depend on the macro browser code itself. However, I should mention that this really is just for the people who like going the cutting edge and want to just be able to see what's possible. These hooks are there, but they potentially could change a little bit in the future. So they're not documented, they're not on CAC. If you're the kind of people who wants to look through the JavaScript code to actually see what they can do, I just thought I'd point them out so that you can look for them yourself. In this case, you can set an override by going AJS macro browser set macro.js override. Pass in your macro name and an override JavaScript object. That object can have a few different properties which will affect the way that they interact with the form. I'll go through these 3, and then there are some really obscure ones that I think are only used once ever in the system, and even I would have to read the code to understand what they did. Okay. Now the field itself is the way that the field is rendered on the form. So you might say, oh, well, I'd like a color picker. All right, you guys haven't done one yet, but I'd like to do one for my particular macro. You know, it can't be that hard. I already have one. Well, what you can do is you can specify that particular types, and you could certainly have a color type, and even a parameter name to say this type and this name, so only one parameter would actually have that component, and specify a function which in turn gets quite complicated, but it allows you to specify an object that gets returned which does all of the population of the field. Again, if you want to get into this kind of stuff with me, I'd love to afterwards, but you know who you are. In this case, by the way, all it's doing is saying we have a hidden field implementation which allows you to not show certain fields in the macro browser but still use their values. Okay. Now, before params set and before params retrieve do what you would expect they do, and they kind of perform as a bit of a massage layer in between what you store and what you show to the user. Sometimes you might have found that what you've had in wiki markup for the whole time that you've been developing a macro isn't perhaps the final product. What we found with the Office connector was that we had a space key parameter and we had a page title parameter, but what we often do with the autocomplete, for example, is just to have the space and the page in the one parameter. It's pretty basic stuff, but you have to do a little bit of massaging on the way into the macro browser if you have those kind of splitting apart or putting back together, or in otherwise kind of tweaking your parameters before you show them to the user. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll just show you, probably terrify you, just for a couple of seconds with some of the Office Connector JS code for the people who really want it, and then a much more friendly and short 5-minute demo of me updating a macro. Okay. This is the actual code that we use for the Office Connector, and you can probably skip that bit at the top there. But the whole idea that I want to show you here is that the parameters map basically comes in, it's manipulated based on whatever logic you choose to add, and then in this case it's just doing certain things for pages that have spaces defined against them, and then if you're a date, so you're a blog, then you can update the page in a certain way, and this is what will then get passed to the UI fields in the macro browser. On the way out, it's a similar deal. These are the parameters coming out of the UI fields, and you can massage them in any way you like. In this case, everything is in a single field, so then we split it out again as is required. So you have that amount of flexibility. You know, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty, but if you want to present something particular to the user, you can do that. Okay, and now I'll just quickly show you a couple of fields. Well, one of the things you may have seen in the Office Connector macro, if you've used it, this is, for example, view a PDF, to embed a PDF or a Word document or Excel inside of a page, is that once you've selected a page, you get an attachment selection, a select box basically, which is pre-populated via Ajax with the contents of that page. That's all done via the JavaScript in here. So you could make this work in your plugins as well if you wanted to make any kinds of REST calls to get the data to populate other fields in your form. So we have that for the attachment. Yeah, there's a little bit there. And then the space key and the date that you saw being massaged out so that we could just have a single autocomplete field, they're set up to be hidden so that we can kind of persist their parameters, the values there, but not show them to the user. And this is where we specify a dependency. Again, I'm probably the person, you will get my email address at the end of this if you really want to get into this. But you can specify a dependency between one field and another so that when one field is changed, it fires a routine on another one. So that's also exposed to you. All right. Well, now it comes time to the demo, and it is pretty straightforward. Let's perhaps create a macro. It's just an ABC macro. This is very similar to the one that you would have seen loaded up before. Let's just refresh the page here. You may have noticed that I just skipped the command line, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how I did that later. Okay, so we have an ABC macro. It's not too exciting. Some of your macros may potentially look like this, and if so, I have pity. Okay, let's get a little bit more basic metadata in there. So an internationalisation file and an image resource. And then let's update it with perhaps a documentation URL. It can be pretty basic to start with. Okay, that's just going to point to your icon for it. However, I did mention that the first thing you should do when playing with metadata is to add a parameters element. And I'll throw in a category for you as well. Okay, so that's all the change we need to make right now to the XML file itself. And you probably had these two at the top to start with, and most of the macro as well. Oops. Okay, so let's just pop back again. And our key is demo plugin. Our macro is ABC. Okay. Okay, so we should be able to search on easy. Let's have a look at that now. All right, it's looking a little bit more interesting in the macro browser. And it appears in the administration category. We can also search for it using either the title or parts of the description. So yeah, you don't have a huge amount of space for the description, but you certainly have enough so that you can get some keywords that people might be looking for. All right, let's have a look at the form for that. As you might have guessed, empty parameters means no form. So let's add some in there. Okay, we know what a string looks like, so I'll just add you a little flag, Boolean. And perhaps, actually, let's do something with an autocomplete. Okay, so that's in there. Let's update our internationalisation. I'll just grab something there. Confluence content. Okay, and notice that you don't have to add a description for every field. You leave it out, you just don't get one in the browser. It's pretty straightforward there. So the flag should have one. Well, the flag shouldn't have one, and the Confluence content should. Type something here. Okay, so we have that. We have that. Let's refresh that. Here he is again. And now we have a form. So it's pretty basic, but just with those few changes, I can now search for content. And I could have gone back into here, and I could set it to required. I could make any other changes, and you probably have an idea already about the different macros that you have that you could update. All right. So again, that demo was just using Atlas run in one command, one terminal window, Atlas CLI in another one, and I was using something that Don Brown had dreamed up called FastDev. Now, he hasn't actually released that yet, but hopefully by me telling you about it now, that'll force him to do it. It's pretty cool. What it does is, based on a URL filter, it tells the command line to reload a particular plugin so that you can skip that step. So make a change in the IDE, straight across to the browser, refresh your page, and you've made your change to the plugin. So that's pretty cool. So you've probably been watching this entire demonstration saying, this stuff is so obvious, but I did see a few hands that were down. So if you're starting out creating a Confluence macro, I recommend that you do your metadata as you go. You don't have to do it as something that you tack on later. It really is so easy. So you'll find this slideshow in the usual place in a couple of moments. Go through, list your macros once you have a few moments. Hopefully you don't have hundreds of them like we had to do for 3.0. Update them, I guess, for the browser first. I always find that easy. You can kind of get a production line going, get some icons, get some titles and descriptions going, and then you should be able to see them all in one hit. And then update for the form itself. That's perhaps a little bit more difficult. You'll have to decide which ones have aliases, maybe go through your source code and figure out what types you should use, things like that. And finally, if you're up to it, yeah, go nuts with the JavaScript and contact anyone from Confluence that you need to if you need help. So if you have any questions about that, ask me outside, but if you have any questions that aren't to do with the JavaScript, feel free now. Thank you. Yep.
That macro fields file, where does that get hooked into the plugin?
Into the plugin. Oh, okay. So that macro field file that's referenced in a web resource. So if I go back a few steps here, oh, yeah. So that's done in here. So you would specify a web resource, and then that points to that JavaScript file. And then by specifying a context of macro browser, that means that that'll get included as a script tag in the head of your, in this case, it will basically be the editor page. And the dependency, you should put that in as well for now. And that just basically means that it depends on, for example, the ags.macrobrowser object. So that's all you would have to add in there. Anyone else? And again, if you want to get into the really technical stuff, yeah, I can see people getting up. All right, well, thank you very much.